Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Wednesday, November 12th, and what's been on your mind recently?
What's
You've
been
been
on my
thinking
mind?
about?
All kinds of stuff. Well, one thing that's been on my mind is Sudan. Yeah, I think it was last Friday you asked me about it. I really didn't have anything to say about it. I read a very interesting, a very informative article about it recently and gathered some other information. So we could discuss that very briefly. I don't have a whole lot to say, but I think it's something worth looking at. Um, yeah, the main focus of most of the news on Sudan has, other than the horrible atrocities themselves, has been UAE involvement. The UAE is a supporter of the RSF. That's the Rapid Support Forces that apparently carried out a lot of these atrocities. Um, they are, well, they are a group that was established in Darfur over in the western part of Sudan. There is um, where actually gold is mined in Sudan, and so it's an economically important region for that reason. The UAE established a connection with basically a warlord there who has gained control of the gold supply, and a lot of that gold actually that he exports from Sudan goes directly to the UAE. And this warlord has become the most powerful or the wealthiest man in Sudan. So anyway, we have the government in Khartoum, which has been supported by or it has sort of an informal alliance or an informal military relationship with some Islamist groups. And the Rapid Support Forces are not Islamist, and I think that's important. As part of the UAE is actually very anti-Islamist. It's obviously a Muslim country, but it doesn't like Islamist groups. It sees them as a threat to its own power. Its monarchy. They actually tend to be, the Islamist groups can be democratic in a way, like Hamas, is one example, or the Muslim Brotherhood. And they want to have nothing to do with them. So they've been supporting the Rapid Support Forces. And now on the other side, I think you also have
Well,
Kenya, for some reason, supports them. And a third country, which I can't recall right now, but I think also within Africa. Now, on the government side, you have a number of countries supporting the government, centered in Khartoum. Russia is among them. It's one of several countries that does support the government. I don't know the extent of Russian involvement, but it has provided some support for the government. So anyway, that's where we are. And, it's interesting. I guess I found interesting the fact that you had the UAE again supporting the Rapid Support Forces, and on the other side you actually have Saudi Arabia, which shows they're often seen as they can be at times, they've been close allies, but there are obvious frictions and conflicts. And here is a conflict that's being played out in Sudan. People have said that it's a new emir of the UAE that has some imperial ambitions. He's the previous emir, his father, was actually, a very different kind of person. He had a very different vision for the UAE. He had no interest in getting involved in these conflicts. But his son is very different. He wants to extend UAE influence, create something, almost an empire of some sort. Maybe not an empire in name, but in economic fact. So that's what we're looking at. Again, remember that the UAE is actually a member of BRICS. So it's a complicated picture. It's not something that I think you can fit. We have a tendency, to look for, are they on the Western hegemony side, or are they on the BRICS side? And some conflicts you can fit neatly into those categories, but I don't think you can do that with this particular conflict.
okay, well, so the Rapid Support Forces, they're not an Islamist group. Then what are they? Are they gold miners? What is this?
Yeah, well, they have they have their base in Darfur. You can say Sudan is has a mixed African and Arab population. And I think in Darfur, they have both, I believe, if I'm correct, let me think about this for a second. I'm not actually sure exactly what his base is, what the ethnic base is within Darfur. So I don't want to venture a guess. But yeah, I think it's just, it's locally based, based on ethnic ties and economic interests. And it's not ideological.
But this conflict, the way you're describing it, doesn't sound like it's organic, right? It's the UAE that was backing one group, and then you said there's Saudi Arabia. Is this how most of these conflicts are? Are they often, or there's just maybe an organic seed, and then outside forces water it?
I think that's the way to look at it. I think it is fair to say that it's organic. There are real conflicts, that pre-existing conflicts. There's a variety of ethnic groups, and warlords, different groups that would arise even in the absence of foreign intervention. But of course, it becomes exacerbated by the foreign intervention. If weapons weren't supplied, we wouldn't have anywhere from the outside. We wouldn't have anywhere the level of violence that we do have there now.
Okay, and this conflict, do you see it have any impact in the broader geopolitical sense, spilling out, causing, some type of cascading effect or anything, or is it just
I don't see it
horrific with?
Yeah, I mean it is a terrible humanitarian catastrophe. There's no question about that. But I don't see that. Not in the there's always a chance that these things can expand and have achieve greater geopolitical significance. There are Sudan does have resources that are valuable to outside groups like gold, but other resources as well. So there is always the potential for that. I just don't see that at the present time.
Yeah, it's hard to keep up with all these other conflicts, but I've just heard this horrific footage that's been coming out of the Sudan. Supposedly so much blood that you can see it from satellite imagery, and I just realized I just don't know anything about this conflict. But then at the same time, I'm hearing Trump saying that we got to go in guns a-blazing into Nigeria to protect our Christians. So it seems like we're very selective on what conflict to focus on and what to look at. I mean, for me, the conflicts of our time are clearly Gaza and what's happening in Ukraine, because we are directly involved in the reshaping the whole world. And then there are these other conflicts that are constantly going on that are humanitarian disasters and crises. And then it seems like the world uses these other conflicts just kind of as just talking points for their own side. They don't actually care about these conflicts. It's just like, oh, why you could talk about Gaza when there's this atrocity in Sudan? They use that as just sort of a something to deflect, and then we'll be like, we won't talk about Sudan, but we got to talk about what's happening in Nigeria. So it becomes difficult for us to try to make sense of everything that's happening in the world. Like they're trying to appeal to our humanity, which we don't want to see all the suffering in the world, and to take your humanity. Don't focus on this one. Focus on this one, and
Right. It isn't possible, I think, to really keep track of all these conflicts. And in humanitarian terms, the conflict in Sudan, and there are some other conflicts like in Central Africa, do rival, the conflicts that we're seeing in the Middle East and Ukraine. At least, in some respects. I think there's no question about it. So they do deserve attention. They just don't have the geopolitical significance. It's not part of this great conflict over the emerging new world order, the multipolar world that we see. So that's not the reason that we don't focus on it. And then also it's, there's just this moral question. Yes, it's terrible. And if there's something we can do, we should do it, as a country. But we're not directly involved in the way that we are in those other conflicts. We are very directly involved. And you can say, in large part, responsible, certainly complicit in the case of the horrors that are taking place in Palestine. And I don't think you can say that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think you can say that about those other conflicts. So we don't have the same degree of moral responsibility. But if there's something that that governments, outsiders can do, and certainly they can, they should try to play a positive role. Um,
Yeah, well, I'm almost even just afraid to say that, to play a positive role, because then everybody says like, well, what?
mhm.
Basically, you're telling people to choose a side, and then that's the problem
Yeah,
with that's what makes a conflict geopolitically significant, right? That's
good
why
point.
Gaza and Ukraine are politically significant, because everybody has to take a side and play a role, and we're converging around this. The world's bifurcating from because of these conflicts, so. I think the real, as awful as it sounds, it seems like a non-interventionist approach is really the only right approach, unless you are directly, a neighbor country, you're directly involved. These are your people. You have some type of responsibility.
Hmm.
Then I see it. But the problem is, I think that's why Ukraine and Gaza are geopolitically significant.
Right.
Is the whole world is now involved.
Yeah.
Would you say that's correct assessment?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And it's a good point. I mean, it's hard. Um, in one way, you can say, oh, this is terrible. We need to intervene. But the intervention actually can quite simply intensify the conflict. You intervene, okay, and then there are the other side sees the need to intervene, and even more arms pour in, and it becomes just an insoluble conflict that rages at an even higher level of intensity. It's as awful as it is. I think there should be efforts to just try to get everybody to pull out, of course, to encourage peace talks, all of that. But I think you're right. One thing is that, as we can see in Ukraine and Palestine, we declare ourselves as, the guys wearing the white hats, the good guys, and we intervene. And more often than not, and I think most clearly in the case of Ukraine and in Palestine, we actually intervene on the wrong side, because we have a limited understanding, or our understanding is shaped by other forces. So, the assumption, again, that we know what's right, that we actually understand these conflicts. I barely understand what's happening in Sudan. I just have a very superficial knowledge. So, but it's probably as good as like anybody in the State Department, unfortunately, or the kind of people that would make decisions in our governments. And they would just end up looking at it in terms of domestic politics or, other interests. And the decision that would be made is almost certainly not going to be one that's actually in the interest of that country. We just don't understand these places. We really don't there's no reason for us to choose sides, because we don't really know either side and have any connection to them. And whatever we do would be, almost certainly to have whatever intervention that we would carry out would almost certainly have negative consequences.
Right. So I think what's so scary about the conflicts that we have going on now in Gaza and Ukraine is that the whole world is taking a side, that everybody is becoming involved and has an opinion. I mean, in previous wars that we had that have been horrific and have been very damaging to the countries we obviously invaded and attacked, but to the United States as well, and the West in general. I'm talking about like Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. We can go on. The list is endless. But most people around the world, they didn't really take a side. This wasn't a line that was drawn in the sand that somebody said that you have to be on this side or this side. Most countries just like, okay, we're just not being involved in it. But now we are. So does this mean that you think that when this happens, when you have the whole world taking two sides, bifurcating like it is, does that ultimately mean that we will be going into some type of major conflict? Is it just
Well,
that's what it
yeah,
feels like? Because
right,
you've gone
right,
so far and everybody
hmm
has to choose a side.
right.
Can we just say like it's over?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's what you say is particularly true of Ukraine. Less so, but to a certain extent, of what's happening in the Middle East. But clearly, the Ukraine war has a geopolitical dimension. We do have countries lined up on one side and the other, and we have again leaders that are openly talking about an expansion of this war within Europe. So there is real reason for concern there that this is a war that could become global. It could become a world war. The potential for it is there for all of us to see.
I mean, I'm going to read you something from the president of Serbia. He said, "My conclusion is that there's a growing certainty that a war between Europe and Russia will happen. They are preparing for war, or for defense, as they call it, Romania, Poland, Finland, smaller countries too, and the Russians as well. Everyone is preparing. What can come from that? Only conflict." So that's President of Serbia, Vucic. And when I read that, it's like, yeah, it kind of makes sense. It just seems like that's where we're going. And if you look historically, there's been conflicts. I'm just thinking of like World War One, when you had all the leaders, the old monarchies. They're all cousins, right? Like Kaiser Wilhelm writing to his cousin in the UK or his cousin in Russia and saying, "Dear Willie, I hope everything's fine with you and your family. Yeah, things are getting a little crazy here, but everything will be fine." And then before you know it, the whole Europe is embroiled in a war. And we just kind of look at these things like World War One, World War Two. They were just like things that had to happen, that were just there, figures of our, pillars of our history. But if you were leading up to the war, both of those wars, there were so many people that maybe we're talking kind of like how we're talking, like that we can't, this conflict can't happen. It shouldn't happen. How devastating it would be. And then it happens. And so I'm just wondering if I'm afraid that we're in that situation now where we're just saying like, it can't happen.
Right.
It's just, we'll be realistic. The consequences are so devastating. But it's happened multiple times before. And every time before these conflicts happen, people say the same thing.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I think that's very true. In fact, it was true before the outbreak of the Ukraine war, that most Ukrainians just felt like, they heard all this talk about an impending war. But you just had the sense it just seems unreal. It's just so far from the present reality that you can't believe it. And then it happened. And here we are. I guess there is this tendency to say, yeah, well, it can't really. That's just so crazy. But of course it could. I don't think there's anything inevitable about a world war, but it could. It's not at all difficult to imagine scenarios where this war could expand and spill over into other countries. We've come close to that, I think, already. There's a constant potential for that. And then we just get this constant war talk from European leaders. And the thing that in itself is disturbing. It's just like you keep on talking about war. You start to make it, you begin to make it real. It's just that I think you increase the likelihood for it. It's just that where it was something that could not be considered, that was just, was completely off the table. Now it's on the table. You've put it on the table and it made it an option. Again, we've talked about the constraints, the barriers to that, but let's not underestimate the capacity for human error, for human folly. Again, I wouldn't put any trust in the wisdom of these leaders. And we may find ourselves in a world war at some point. I think that's certainly possible. A European war, which could turn into a world war.
Yeah, we've talked before about the possibilities of false flags, and we often talk about it if Israel does a false flag attack, because we've seen them do that in the past. They have a history of it, and we know that they want to drag us into a war with Iran. But we haven't really talked about it so much. We have a little bit, but with Ukraine, triggering a World War III scenario. But there was this story, I heard it from Alexander McCurris, I think you did as well, about essentially a Ukrainian plot to take a MiG fighter jet, they bribe one of the guys, the pilot, he kills the navigator, and then he fires a Kinjal missile at a NATO base. That was the plot supposedly unveiled. I don't know how true this was, but just this idea, like the lengths that people might go to try to get a war started. I feel like a false flag would be more likely to succeed in the Ukraine war than it would in Israel, Iran, Palestine, because I think everybody is looking out, expecting Israel to carry a false flag. I think the narrative and the opinions surrounding the Ukraine war are much more mixed, and the effectiveness of a false flag succeeding if Ukraine carries one out, I think, is higher. What do you think about it?
Oh yeah, the potential for a false flag is always there, and first of all, Ukraine has not been reluctant to carry out all kinds of operations on Russian soil. We see them. Some of them, a lot of them are broken up by the FSB, but by the Russians. But some of them have been successful assassinations, and of course there was Operation Spiderweb. The sabotage, so on and so forth. They do have the capacity to act on Russian soil. They have a willingness. And would they carry out a false flag? Certainly. I mean, especially as the situation on the ground, in the battlefields becomes increasingly grim for them, as we see. That's a trend. It's only going to get worse. There's going to be this increasing desperation. And there's going to be this realization that our only chance, our only way out of this is to get NATO in on our side. And how can we do that? We can attempt a false flag. I think we've seen some kind of feeble attempts at false flags already. There was that missile that landed in Poland. I think it was back in 2022 and killed a farmer and one other individual. And immediately there's some question. There are two stories. One, that this was just a missile that went off course. But others argue that that's just not possible. It actually had to have been fired into Poland deliberately by the Ukrainians. It was an air defense missile. But immediately the Ukrainians seized on it and tried to get a NATO country to declare Article 5, to get Poland to do that. Now that NATO shut it down, I think they understood what was going on and they didn't let that happen. And then we had the drone attack on Poland too, and I think that was something similar, another false flag. So we've seen them. There have been rumors about false flags directed against the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. And we've seen many, many attacks on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. The idea seems to be that they want to create some kind of nuclear accident there and then blame it on the Russians. Have a cloud of radioactive material drifting towards Europe and say, look what the Russians have done. Essentially they're attacking you. Time for Article 5. So there's every reason to believe that I think that they're going to, first of all, that they have attempted false flags and that they're going to continue to, and they may succeed. They can be really quite clever. We've seen, and with help probably from the British. That's
what I was going to say.
Yeah.
The crazy thing is it's going to be, I think, NATO members that are involved within a false flag on themselves.
Right.
Like, that's what's so crazy. It's because it seems like, especially the Brits, they really want this war. And I feel like it's pretty pathetic of them, and because they're so far away. And they're willing to, let's start this huge conflict in Eastern Europe. And, don't worry, they'll have to go through Poland and Romania. We'll sacrifice all of them before they come to the UK. It's like, you guys are way over here on this island. Like, why are you so invested in this conflict that's on the other side of Europe from you? It just doesn't make sense. Like, why do you care so much?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, but they do have that obsession. There's no question about it.
Is it just ego? It's just like, they wanted that Churchill, spirit. They just want to replicate that so much.
I guess it's just hard to let go of it. They were the world power for, over a century, and it's something that's hard to let go of.
Yeah, a century ago. It's been a long time. Exactly. Nobody's alive back from that day, hardly anybody.
Yeah, but I guess just the ghost of the imperial past continues to haunt England. That's all I can say. I
Well,
don't,
that sucks because then it just seems like we are having to pay for this, the inertia from our history just continues. We can't escape it. It's like is it going to be here in America? We're going to have to continue living after empire dies. There's just going to be this empire mentality in the US for the next 100 years that, oh, we still need to be number one somehow. And
oh,
then,
it's possible. There's no question about it. It's possible that could happen. Yeah, those old dreams, they don't, it's just a dream of the Roman Empire haunted Europe for many centuries afterwards. And it was finally abandoned, I guess, really with Westphalia and the fall of the Holy Roman Empire.
I just feel like I just feel like we're going for World War III, and I think they're going to get their way because they're just the people in charge don't give a damn about anything else. Let's tank our economies. We don't care about our people, whatever. Just get rid of welfare programs. We gotta have this war. And if they just stick on it and just never change their position, they eventually seem to get what they want.
Yeah, well, there's a real risk. Again, they don't have the popular support now. It's not like they're responding to any sort of public pressure. Quite the reverse. But they do have this obsession, and we can see it with the leading countries of Western Europe. We're talking about France, Germany, and the UK. Each one of those leaders is just obsessed with Ukraine to the detriment of their respective countries. Now, maybe in the end they'll all fail ignominiously. And they'll be replaced by people who are more reasonable. There's reason to hope for that. But you're right. These people are just obsessed with it. They do have a good amount of power, and they can make things happen. It's just like the public is not with them, but perhaps a false flag can bring the public, into line. This has happened in the past. It's happened in the U.S. It's false flags are often very effective. Let's be honest.
Right. And if you're unpopular, and then if a war breaks out, then then everything else is forgotten, and now it's all about the war. And
yeah,
well,
you see,
yeah.
I was just going to say that logic applies within Ukraine too. I was just reading. I've been reading a lot on the history of Ukraine leading up to the conflict, and prior to the outbreak of the war in 2022. The launch of the SMO, Zelensky was very unpopular. Which is, he was actually following the trajectory that previous presidents, I think Yats, the one that was selected by Victoria Nuland, he got down to 2% or something, and Poroshenko wasn't much better. But then you found Zelensky was actually just, his popularity ratings or approval ratings were following the same trajectory. They were dropping. He was way down and underwater. And the war was actually to his benefit. That's what saved him. That's what made him, this great Churchillian figure. And that could be true with these other people. Again, their approval ratings are I think in every case under 20% and close to 10%. I think the last one I saw from Macron was 11%. But a war, if it's, especially if it's, if it started or, if it's ushered in by some sort of false flag that attributes some sort of, barbarism to the Russians, it can get everybody's blood boiling. And they, all of a sudden their president, this Macron or Starmer or Merz, now they're great. They represent the nation. We stand behind them. They're our leaders, and we want to march forward and meet the Russian horde. And we're a long way from that. But you see that, maybe that's just it's not going to work with today's Europe. I hope that's true. But again, losing politicians often have a way of, often look to war as a way out of their political difficulties.
Are we getting close to the point where that decision is going to be made on direct NATO intervention? Are we getting to that point? Because we've talked about it before, and you said you don't think it'll actually happen. There's no popular support. I'd like to think that's true, but at the same time, I haven't seen any ability for the West to to de-escalate. They only have like the Alexes say, there's no reverse gear when it comes to the neocons, when it comes to these the elite.
Yeah.
And you have a president that was elected repeatedly saying, "I'll have this war done in 24 hours." There, I just want the killing to stop. To thunderous applause, people that whenever he says this is what he was elected. Why he was elected was to end wars.
Yeah,
one of the main reasons. One of the main reasons. I mean, it resonated with a lot of people. We just didn't want it. And now what we have is just we have Joe Biden 2.0, and maybe it's worse now because he's just so erratic, and so it's like it's not possible. If you had somebody that campaigned saying that he's going to end this war, and then we're in the situation we're in now, it's like then we just can't end it, and then that means it just has to keep on going, and we're getting to the point where Pokrovska's fallen, Kupiansk is surrounded, the lights are out throughout Ukraine. They're on the brink. They're out of men. Forced conscription videos. I just saw on the news today that there was a man that was is it the TASS? Those are the ones that are trying to, the forced conscription guys. They're going out there, and they try to conscript some guy, and he shot two of the conscriptors. So it's like you can see it's at a boiling point. They're running out of men, running out of money. We've talked about this, running out of time.
Right. Desertion rates are very, very high, and they're getting higher every month. Right.
Right. So we're getting to, we don't say collapse. I think Mark Sablota says it's a crumbling, but a crumbling, an incipient collapse is what you said. So that means we're getting to this point, right, that we're going to have to find out whether or not this will happen. And I think it might happen.
Yeah, it might. Again, I know it just might. Yeah, the thing is, right, they are not, I think as I said yesterday, it's clear that Putin actually has tried to provide off-ramps and has made compromises that were politically difficult for him. And we even accepted the plan that Trump gave to gave to Putin at the Alaska, right? I mean, there was a plan. Right. We offered the plan. It was right, and he accepted it. That's right. Anyway, that's exactly what Lavrov says. He doesn't give us details of the plan, but I think we can piece it together from these leaks what it was, and it did involve, a significant compromise. Again, a ceasefire in Zaporozhye in Kherson. That was a significant compromise for the Russians. And again, it would be politically unpopular. Again, there are a lot of people within the Russian government. Now, I think the idea was that this is temporary. Eventually, you get it all, but there's really no guarantee of that. You accept a ceasefire, it would be very, very hard for the Russians later to get those territories. I think that's obvious. So anyway, there are these opportunities, and there's just a refusal. Opportunities, of course, prior to the war to avoid the war altogether. The Russians came with their plans and offers to negotiate, and we wouldn't. So, we're just still on this no negotiation. It's just like the only solution is total victory on our side. And that's just a formula for disaster. And again, it's a formula actually for humiliating defeat for the NATO side. And so it's either going to be, I think it's going to be humiliating defeat for the NATO side one way or the other. And it's just a question of, is it going to end just within Ukraine, with a humiliating defeat for NATO? Or is it going to end, will the end actually take place after NATO intervenes? And then we have Russia actually will defeat NATO on the battlefields, or, the battlefield is actually going to expand, and they're going to strike military facilities throughout Europe. There's going to be missiles flying into Germany and France and the UK, that is not going to be safe in those missiles. That's the horror, and because that does take us up right to the brink of nuclear war. And, God forbid that happens, but there's a chance, if you refuse to negotiate, and it's clear that they are, they're just insisting, they're delivering ultimatums, and it's basically they haven't budged from their original position. Essentially that, I guess you have to say they budged a bit. Before they didn't even, like the Ukrainians didn't even talk about a ceasefire. Now that they see they're losing, they want a ceasefire, but that's all. I think that the hope is that, it would give them time to regroup and rebuild and rearm and start it again. But, again, it's you could say that Europe is its own worst enemy in this case. There, there's, it won't end well for them, no matter what. It would end better now. It would be a humiliation, but the humiliation is going to be greater down the road. So they should do something now, of course, but they won't. They show no willingness, no awareness. You get those kind of lone voices of reason from people like Orban or, Vucic, who you quoted earlier. Of course, he's not part of the EU, but he's part of Europe. But they're not being heard. These people are just immediately condemned, actually. It's not like, okay, yeah, let's consider this. Let's debate this. No, this is outside of debate. It's just like, we have to continue the course. Anything else is capitulation. And they painted it all in those terms. And so I just don't see any exit from the course that we're on.
I just feel like if there was a direct war between NATO and Russia, that it would go nuclear very quickly, because we all know where this goes, right? It's game theory. We've never had a war between two nuclear powers, like this, and it's just like if you're doing the game theory, it's just like, okay, well, who wins? You got to strike first, right? Like, where is this going to go? Do you think that that's true, that it could go nuclear very fast if this happens?
It could. Of course, we've never been there, and we've gamed it, but that's still not reality. We've never been there, But it's the sort of thing where, if it only has to happen once, for.
It's so crazy to even talk about it, but the reason I talk about it and bring it up is just because I just don't see the ability for the West to back down, to admit defeat. I hope that we can just say that this Ukraine war is over, but it just doesn't feel possible now. I've lost hope. I was hopeful at the beginning of the year, and now it's all gone.
Yeah. No, I don't see it ending. And the big question is, will it spread? Will it become a direct war? Not just a proxy war, but a direct war between NATO and Russia? And
what do we have to hope for?
I just wanted to add one thing is that,
sorry.
It's just that the Russians, I think, if they occasionally remind everybody, hey, there's in the background of all this is the potential for nuclear war. And we do have the means to destroy, don't think that you'll be safe if it goes there. And, that's one reason for unveiling the Burevestnik and the Poseidon and the Oreshnik and these other new weapons.
Well, look at Trump's response. He's like, I'm going to move my nuclear subs off of your, right outside of Moscow.
And we're going to renew nuclear testing. Right. Yeah, exactly. This is not, things are different. And during the Cold War, those threats led to negotiations. There was an understanding that, we could actually destroy the world. And we may not like the Soviets, but they do have the power to destroy us. So we need to talk to them and we need to work something out. And we did, but you just don't see the same consciousness now. I mean, I was just thinking yesterday is that we have this very strange situation where the Westerners the Western media, Western leadership in general is always describing Putin as a madman, which is just not true. It's just he's anything but a madman. But he's described that way. He's a mad dictator. You often get these descriptions. And then when he points out, hey, we have these nuclear weapons, there should be real fear. And say, a madman has nuclear weapons. We need to do something. We need to work something out. We don't like him. We hate him, but we need to work something out to make us safer. Reach some sort of agreement. We could at the very least extend the START treaty, right? Which he's offered to do. At the very least, that's the last controls that we have that's going to keep things. We could also restart the Open Skies Treaty, which allowed both sides to inspect, the other side's capabilities. That's something we pulled out of too. But we could start again. The Russians have made it clear that they're willing to restart those. It just seems like, okay, you think he's a madman. He's a mad dictator. You know that he has these weapons. Why don't you go talk to him? You may hate him, but it's just like, there's just this, the people that lead our countries are not like the people that led our countries during the Cold War. Those were sane men. They were actually statesmen, and they reached some agreements that really pulled us back from the brink. we don't have those people here, in charge anymore. And that's the worrying thing. Again, they maybe deep down, they understand the risk. We've seen evidence of that. Again, I spoke about the former NATO General Secretary saying that he was asked by Zelensky to impose a no-fly zone, and he explained to Zelensky, "We can't do that. If we do that, that's World War III." Yeah. But the thing we've also seen, just kind of this steady escalation, where we're doing things that we would have thought of unthinkable, even from our own perspective, even according to the words of our own leaders just a couple of years ago. We're going right up to the point of talking about delivering tomahawks, for example, or at least, sending troops, they call them reassurance troops, into Ukraine. This is really crazy talk, which even at the beginning of the war was not considered. We've gone far towards that. So I still believe, maybe because I just feel like I have to believe, the alternative is so horrifying. I still believe that we'll stop when we get to the precipice, but we keep on approaching it, and that is very worrying.
It's surprising me that nobody is talking about the potential danger of World War III and a nuclear war. At least our elites aren't. And for the most part, most people in the West, I don't think, are that conscious of it because it just seems like it's too implausible. But we've just talked about it. It's just the trajectory things are going. It's not too many logic steps you have to take to see where this could potentially go. And so it's just amazing that nobody's talking about it. But you have people talking about, should we, shoot Tomahawk missiles at Russia? Like, well, there's consequences to that, right? Well, what happens when you do that? Do we not think beyond that? Or let's send in 80,000 troops to Ukraine. Like, there's consequences to that too. What are you saying? What happens when that happens? And then it's like, oh, nuclear war is what happens? Let's defeat Russia. What does that mean, defeating Russia? Nuclear war? Can we not understand? You don't have to go too far. But the fact that nobody is talking about this is really worrying. There used to be nuclear drills during the Cold War, right? I mean, people hide under their desk like it's going to do something, but at least people were conscious of it.
Right. Yeah, I know. It is very worrying. It's very strange, but the risk of nuclear war has become a Russian talking point, according to the Western media. And so you can't bring it up. When you bring it up and you say, hey, let's stop. This is just too dangerous. We don't like what Russia did. We don't like the Russians. We don't like Putin, but we have to talk and we have to pull back from the brink here. That's apparently a Russian talking point because that's what the Russians want. But you stop and think, you say, okay, the Russians want it, but maybe we should want it too. Okay. Again, it's not like it's just Russia that's going to be vaporized. It's going to be the whole Western world. There's the potential for that. And you ought to be thinking about it. It just seems like, again, we've entered into this, I guess, a postmodern world, almost a post-truth world where everything is about the narrative. And the Russians have their narrative, we have our narrative. And reality seems to just sort of disappear. It becomes just one of the less important factors in all this. It's all about the narrative. And if you are actually adopting some so-called Russian talking points, you're undermining our narrative and you need to go away and shut up. That's where we are. We got to get out of that. We got to get out of that frame of mind.
Yeah, I think another problem is that this is just happening against the backdrop of so much other crazy stuff that's happening here. So people don't have the mental bandwidth to absorb all of it, to think about it, and I do too. I just kind of, just when we started this conversation, I didn't know where it was going to go. And then I'm just like, oh my God, nuclear war, this is what happened, because I've been so, busy with the MAGA civil war, what's happening, with the Israeli lobby and this mass noticing and awakening that's happened in this country. And I'm just thinking how this is going to destroy the country, that this is tearing the country apart. And on the backdrop of the Epstein stuff as well, the fact that maybe a good portion of our government are blackmailed pedophiles and they're controlling. You had the president of Colombia. I don't know if you saw him talking about it, just openly saying like, yeah, you have the America is run by pedophiles. Like it's like it's mainstream amongst other countries now. It's just so crazy. And then you have it on the backdrop of what's happening with the genocide in Gaza still that's ongoing. That we had this live stream to us in 4K and we're asked to pay for it. And then like this is obviously a very important thing. And then we just kind of forget, oh yeah, we might have nuclear war because of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. Yeah. There's just so much madness going on in the world, which makes me feel like when there is so much madness, when people are focusing on Epstein, are focusing on the Charlie Kirk assassination, are talking about the undue influence of the Israeli lobby in the United States and how they own all of our congressmen, then that also makes me feel like, well, the way to solve this problem, because we talked about it before, that the Zionist position is indefensible. We can't defend it. Everybody's making us want to have this national debate over Zionism. We can't do it because we can't win the argument. Boom, boom, let's start wars. We got to worry about this now because you can't, and we got to make sure that we win this giant war. Forget about everything else. Like, there's so much going on. And there's so many people that are so upset, so much unease and uncertainty, that I feel like the only way out for these people that are in power is war. And there's so many options. We have powder kegs that are already lit. They just have to fan the flames a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I think there's no question about it. It's just that, there is so much madness in the world, so much conflict, so many certainties have been challenged or just shaken, that what seemed impossible has become impossible, and that's part of it. Like war seems a possibility where it for the longest time, for most of my life, actual war between Russia and the U.S. just was so far beyond the pale. It was understood to be so catastrophic. That we all understood that we would be wrong to even approach the edge of that precipice. So we all stood back on both sides, right? But now we've lost that. I think it's not just a question of the narrative, as I was pointing out, that we've really lost our grip on reality. I think that's a big part of the problem. But part of it is what you're saying. It's just that there's so much going on. The ground is shifting under our feet that we've lost our focus. And, it's hard to know where the catastrophe is going to come from. That's
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, well, let me shift our focus a little bit back to the Zionist control over here, because I think that is also a real danger, So like I mentioned earlier, we are forcing this national debate now about Zionism and U.S. support to Israel. Like, why should we be supporting Israel here? Why do they need the aid? Why isn't AIPAC registered under FARA? And we said in the last conversation that the Zionist position is just indefensible. But I feel like there has to be some argument that they make, right? Because they have to, you can't just have, how's it possible to have something that's completely meritless? Can't stand on its own two legs at all, but it's been such a foundational pillar of modern America. It defines so much of America, it's embedded into our culture, into our fabric, this Zionism. And you're telling me that there's no argument that they can make? There has to be something, because this national debate is getting forced. We want to see it. People are saying like, okay, right. Ben Shapiro, then debate Nick Fuentes, interview him yourself. You hate Tucker so much, do it, interview it. Yeah. Let's hear it. Let me hear why we have to do this. There has to be, they have to have some type of argument. I don't think they'll win. I don't think it'll win.
I'm
but
sure they have some type of argument, but it's a very, very weak argument, and it's overwhelmed by the evidence on the other side.
So they know they'll lose in a national debate.
I think they do, right? And what they've relied on, for so many of these years is this. You can say this fear of being called an anti-Semite. That has become like the electric third rail. It has destroyed many careers where people become accused of that because they do stray from the political plantation, let's say. They switch metaphors. They touch the electric third rail, and then they're just out. They're gone. Their careers are over, or they're relegated to the fringe, and they're out of the national conversation. And that's worked for such a long time. I think part of the problem, first of all, Yeah, it's just like they really don't have much of an argument. It clearly has not been good for America, this relationship that we have with Israel.
I'm just
But it
wondering.
just for such, I'll just very quickly just add that for all these decades, they have not had to argue, and they have been able to shut things down before the argument occurs. And they've been very this label of anti-Semitism has been extremely effective, and so they just come to rely on that. And then even if they did have some kind of argument, I think it's a very limited and weak argument. But their ability to even make that argument has atrophied because they haven't had to make it. So you see these meltdowns. It's just like he's a Nazi, and it's just like, okay, we just have to scream louder that he's an anti-Semite, and then the whole thing will go away. They haven't. They have neither, they don't have the arguments, but they don't even have they have actually even just lost the ability to make the argument because it just hasn't been necessary for such a long time, and now they're in a real fix.
I just find it just what's so crazy about this story is just how is it possible that we've never been able to have this argument for so long? Like that they were able to shut it down, that you were able to make something that has been so foundational, like I said, to modern America, the America that I know, that I grew up in. Zionism has just been completely part of American culture and society, and it was just a statement of fact. And then you're telling me it's based on nothing? Like, how did that happen? How did it just like...
Right. Yeah.
It's just crazy that we just it's just allowed to happen.
Yes, it's not based on nothing, of course. It's been based on a lot of money, and
lies.
Yeah, and lies. They're very effectively told. There's just we. And if you're you can say, well, okay, it's not based on a rational objective assessment of events, but in general people don't do that. It's about emotions, it's about images, and for over the years we've had on the one side this fear. Okay, the ultimate evil is Nazism. That's been drilled into us for a long time. And what is the first evidence that you're a Nazi? It's anti-Semitism. And so there's a real fear of ever making any kind of statement that could be described as anti-Semitic. I mean, I think it's more than, okay, this could end my career, but it's like, oh, maybe I'm a bad person. I've said this. I mean, it's something that is just the emotional, baggage that has been attached to these terms and to this debate is crushing. It's just, so people have just stayed away from it for the longest time. It's not a rational thing, but it's there. Again, going all the way back to the 1960s, and where you could say it really began, the watershed moment was the USS Liberty. Again, Johnson's initial reaction was he was furious. He knew what happened, but there's a lot of evidence. It's just that people approached him and said, if you expose this and you point your finger at Israel, you're going to be smeared as an anti-Semite and you're going to lose this funding and so on. It's a combination of money, but also emotional blackmail. And it worked. And that emotional blackmail has worked since. But now it's no longer working. And I think it's thanks to the Israelis themselves, Netanyahu, and what they have done. I mean, it's just the horror of what they have done in Gaza has overcome, all these emotional barriers that have been built up, deliberately, over the course of decades, and the dam is broken. And now we're seeing, light is finally is shining on these issues that had been kept carefully in the dark for all this time.
Okay, well, if we are forcing the Zionists to have this national debate, it's being put front and center, but they refuse to engage in it, then do you think that the possibility of that they would push for war, we know the Zionist influence in our country, that they would just say, well, we got to detract and we got to do this. Like, what do you see happening if they have the debate? If Ben Shapiro debates someone like Nick Fuentes, and I imagine that Ben Shapiro is going to be left looking pretty stupid because his positions are indefensible. And then if they just ignore it, then it's also just means you lost, right? So the Zionists lose. So when you're in a losing position, what do you do?
Yeah. Well, I'll just bring up what I brought up in the last episode, in that, okay, we have very powerful people that are passionately attached to Zionism. For them, it is their, their raison d'etre. It's just, he says, this is who I am. I am a Zionist above all. And again, these are not fringe people, but very powerful people. We can see their influence. We've seen it for a long time. And they will fight dirty. And I think it could go all the way to, extra constitutional measures. In other words, to say something like a coup. I mean, really, I think I don't see any signs of that happening now. But I don't think these people are going to walk away and say, "Oh, we lost." And they have the means to, they have their hands on the levers of power. They are doing things already. There's obvious and actually quite an open effort to gain control over the media, which I think is ultimately going to fail. And it's being observed. We understand what they're doing. I'd like to think that it's going to fail, that the fact that TikTok is now, is not able to post all these videos, because that was a big part of it, that people are smart enough to understand what's happening and they will go to other platforms. Again, it's just a completely different media and technological environment. And I don't think they're going to be able to exert the control they have in the past, that they are bound to fail. But, when they're really facing failure and they say our efforts have failed, Israel is, the Zionist project is in danger. It may, I just don't see these people walking away and saying, okay, well, we lost, we'll have to do something else. I think we've talked about the Samson option for Israel, which is the nuclear option, that we understand is there, that they, if they're going to fall in lose a war, before they lose a war, they're going to send these nuclear missiles to European capitals. And
is it really European capitals? That's what the Samson option is, that they will blow up London, Moscow, Paris, Berlin, Rome?
Even the Vatican is supposed to be right.
Really?
I mean, that's what's rumored. The thing is, they're never going to come out and say that officially, but that's what's rumored, and I think that's what's believed. And of course, this is always true of nuclear capabilities. It's about deterrence above all. You let people know that you have this. You let them know that this is your intent, and the hope is that will keep them in line. They won't let you lose the war, and that may succeed. I think it's true. So anyway, they do have the Samson option, in military terms and nuclear terms, but they may also have a Samson option in, because they understand that even if they are successful on the battlefields in the Middle East, if they lose the information war, the Eighth Front, as Netanyahu calls it, if that collapses, the Eighth Front collapses, then they are, they cannot actually maintain their hold on a territory in the Middle East, because they are so utterly dependent. Their military power is dependent on U.S. support. And if they lose that U.S. support, then it's curtains for them. So they may have a Samson option for the U.S., or I don't know that they cooked one up yet, but as they approach it, they may think about it, something desperate to maintain their hold on the U.S. And I don't, they can be very imaginative. And Mossad has proved itself to be very, very imaginative. Who knows what they have in store for us?
It's so crazy. It's so terrifying. And there's no solution to this conflict either. There really isn't.
Right. I hope they fail, and I hope that the Samson option, it never takes place. But it is a really, you just don't see a good ending, really, to either of these wars. You can see some less bad endings. Maybe we'll fall short of catastrophe, or the ultimate catastrophe. But it seems like no matter what, it's going to be some kind of catastrophe.
Right. I mean, the good ending I figured would be, as the truth comes out and more people are noticing this parasitic relationship that Israel has with the United States, that that would end it, and then Israel would have to go back to being, well, it never was, but would have to just live within its means. It would have to go back to its borders. It can't forever expand. It can't be carrying out all these conflicts. So it would have to learn how to make peace with its neighbors, or it would just have to disband. But it's just not possible, right? So
Yeah. Well,
and
I'm not going to say it's absolutely impossible, but it just looks like there are a lot of barriers to that. Again, it's just like we talk about, both those zealous supporters of Israel are very powerful within our own country, but then the fanatics that increasingly control Israel, it's just hard to see them. You just say like, oh, okay, yeah, we're going to have to pull back. Netanyahu still is like he's halfway realistic. He's become increasingly closely allied to the fanatics, and I think he does on one level really believe in them, but he shows an ability to be flexible when he has to. But the trend within Israel is towards this increasing fanaticism that is extremely reckless and doesn't seem to be capable of any kind of flexibility. So it is worrying. Maybe I'd like to believe this, that when it becomes clear to them, to the Israelis, because there are reasonable, sensible Israelis. I read the articles that they write in Haaretz. They may be a small minority, but there's something. Maybe they could be empowered by a decline in U.S. support, because I think part of the problem is that U.S. has always axiomatically supported Israel, unconditionally supported Israel, and that has strengthened the most extreme factions to the point where they just feel like they're completely invincible. And then if they lose that sense of invincibility, well, that's dangerous. You don't know where they're going to go. They're going to maybe tear down, Al-Aqsa and build a third temple or something. And but you would just hope that could empower the reasonable people in Israel, and that eventually, I don't see it happening right away. It's just actually, when I talk about it, doesn't seem very possible. But you hope against hope.
Yeah, well, it seems like the U.S. is going to be getting more involved in the region. I've been hearing reports that we're going to be building an air base in Syria, and there's even talk about building something in Gaza. Do you know anything about this?
Okay, yeah. Well, there's a big question mark over the air base outside of Damascus. That I think it was reported by Reuters, and then it was later denied, and who knows? But maybe there's a possibility. There are all kinds of talks going on right now. Of course, we have al-Jolani or al-Sharai in he in the White House and talking to U.S. generals, and so there are negotiations going on there, and I don't know how it's all going to how it's going to work out. I think Israel will be very reluctant to give up the land that they've seized. And Turkey is going to be reluctant to give up the land that it has seized and its influence there. I don't know if they're going to actually achieve some sort of agreement that allows Syria to remain, or to become once again a unitary state. Instead of this Humpty Dumpty, that's been broken apart into so many different pieces. But now, as for what's going on in Gaza, yeah, there was a report that came out, I think, just yesterday. It was actually, it may have been Reuters again, where the report appeared. But the sources were several different European leaders who were saying that they had become increasingly pessimistic about the possibility of any kind of reconstruction taking place within the Hamas-controlled territory. And it looks like, this yellow line that is created, that is actually accounts for more than 50% of Gaza. On the Israeli side of the yellow line is more than 50% of Gaza. It looks like the reconstruction is going to take place there. And so what we may have is we'll see something similar to the green line. If the green line was the lines that were drawn at the end of the War of Independence, if you're an Israeli, the Nakba, the great disaster, the great ethnic cleansing, if you're an Arab. So in 1949, there was these lines drawn. Actually, it was drawn with a green ink, and that's why we call them the Green Lines. The two territories uh, that remained under Palestinian control are or were reserved for a potential Palestinian state were Gaza and the West Bank. Now that was only 22% of the territory of Israel, and they were originally promised, according to the original UN resolution that split Palestine, between the Israeli Jews and between the Palestinian Arabs. It was originally approximately 50%, actually. I think that the Israelis were given a little bit more than that, even though the Arabs had most of the population. Now, they ended up with just 22%, right? And over time, that, of course, has actually decreased. We've seen the settlements in the West Bank, they haven't respected this green line. And then eventually they built the wall. And a lot of people say, well, what's wrong with the wall? A country has a right to build a wall, but it hasn't been built on the green line. We've been there, we've seen it. It goes well into the West Bank. So they just carved out, they have created a new line, which is the wall, which actually takes even more Palestinian territory. And then even on the other side of that, they have, they are constantly establishing settlements and raising villages. The ethnic cleansing has continued in the West Bank and has accelerated. Now we see something, I think, similar happening in Gaza, but it's much worse. Again, this yellow line has been established, and the Israelis, I don't think, are going to give up on the 53 or 58% that they have on their side of the yellow line. And they're going to, I think, eventually they're going to succumb to the pressures from the extreme nationalist right in their country, and they'll start building settlements, in that part of Gaza. That's what they want. That's a promise that was made. Is understood by people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich that that's what they're going to get out of Gaza. And maybe it's going to start on the other side of the yellow line. And then I think we'll see over time. We've actually already seen it. The Israelis don't really respect the yellow line themselves. They'll move it over when it suits them. They'll decide that they have to, take a little bit more of Gazan territories. Now, this is, it's really horrible for the Gazans because it was already a densely populated strip of land, a very small strip of land, and it's been reduced by half. Actually, the Israelis have taken more than half. And so they're just packed within, a really tiny strip of land now. Now, there's talk of letting some Palestinians live on the Israeli side, like in special communities, but they would all be very carefully vetted and monitored. We'll see what happens.
Do you think that this will actually happen, that they'll be able to start doing it without some other type of conflict breaking out? I mean, that Israel will just get away with ethnically cleansing more than half of Gaza and then make an even more densely populated concentration camp?
I think it's possible. They're being pressured again to stick to the 20-point plan by the U.S. and by the Arab states. But I think they know, they can wait them out. They can play these games. They can pretend that they're actually committed to the 20-point plan, just like in the case of the West Bank. They, for decades and decades, they claim to be, committed to this peace process. And they never actually formally annexed that land, but they've been taking it de facto. And so they say, yeah, we're working it out, but Hamas is being so unreasonable. And, they've showed themselves to be very, very skilled at doing that. So my worry, and I think it's, I'm worried with a lot of justification, is that they're simply going to take advantage of this plan. They're going to pretend that they're committed to the 20-point plan, but it just won't move forward. They'll take, when the plan gives them something, they'll take it. But, when it's time for them to give up something, they won't give it up.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll just have to wait and see. I have one last question. Let's pivot to something else really quick. It was a week or so ago, we were talking about the Supreme Court ruling on the tariffs and that we would have a decision pretty soon. Do we know what's going on with that?
I think it's right around the corner, and most people expect the Supreme Court to rule against the Trump administration, against Trump. I guess the question is like, will they give him some kind of wiggle room? Because some of the questions seem to especially from Barrett, seem to be along that, looking for some sort of like middle ground that might allow Trump to actually keep the tariffs in some form. He has to go, he has to do something, observe some kind of procedure or whatever. I don't know exactly what it is. The worst case scenario for the administration is that it's struck down and and the Supreme Court insists that Trump, doesn't have any options. He simply has to actually refund the tariff money, all that money that revenue that has been raised for the tariffs. That's a possibility. That would be the worst case, and that would be a total disaster for Trump. And it looks like there's no chance that from most of the reports that I've been seeing, there's no chance that he'll completely get his way. It's clear that what he's doing is unconstitutional. But sometimes the Supreme Court does it muddles things, and he might have some out. We'll have to see.
Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking, could this potentially sink his presidency and maybe cause a financial collapse or something, and then that gets us out of all this mess. That's kind of what I'm hoping for as the best case scenario, is just some
maybe
kind of economic meltdown before we start launching bombs and
but then it also got to lead to bombs. There's
just no good answers out there, Dad. It's really frustrating. Every time we have these conversations, it's just like, oh, there's just it's just all doom and gloom.
That was scary. I don't think it's all doom and gloom. The rise of the multipolar world is a good thing. It's just that the old unipolar world is not going to go down, without a fight of some kind, without flailing out. And we just hope that won't take an extreme form, that it won't lead to, World War III. And that's where we are. They're going to do some crazy things, but let's hope they're not catastrophically crazy.
Okay, here. All right, let's end it there, Dad.
Okay.
Okay, have a good rest of your day. Talk
You
to you
too.
soon.
Okay,
All right,
bye-bye.